And one of the great problems of history is that the concepts of love and power have usually been contrasted as opposites. What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love, implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love.
I want to start with a question, and I want you to think about this. Clear your mind just for a second and think about this. How did you grow up as it relates to thinking about race? I'm curious. How was race imprinted on your young brain? I've been thinking about that over the last several weeks. As it relates to my situation, I'm sure in many ways it was very much like many of you. In my family, my close family, my dad, my mom, my sister, and then later my stepdad and my stepmom, I never witnessed overt racism, or I never witnessed any ugliness towards African Americans or really any other ethnicity. When I was a child, I remember there was a rhyme, and in that rhyme it contained the N-word, and I remember at about 4 years old saying the rhyme innocently, and I was told that that was not a word I should ever say, and I don't think I've said that word since. So that was kind of our household. That wasn't a part of what we did. I remember when I was a little boy, Lester Maddox was a restaurateur in Atlanta, and he had a restaurant called the Pick Rick Restaurant near Georgia Tech, and big chicken house. They'd have 400 people could be in there. It was a big place near Georgia Tech, but he was an avid segregationist, and it was a big part of his whole shtick. And when the Supreme Court announced that you could no longer run a segregated business, he said he was closing his business. But the next day, after that announcement came down from the Supreme Court, 3 African-American seminarians went to the Pick Rick Restaurant to eat, and Lester Maddox met them with a loaded gun, and all of the patrons in the Pick Rick got axes off of the wall. Lester Maddox later would call them Pick Rick drumsticks, and that became part of his marketing shtick, and it became a part of his legacy. He would give out these little bats, a baseball bat kind of things. He'd call them Pick Rick drumsticks. But anyway, they surrounded the African Americans. It was a horrible thing. He ended up closing his restaurant, said, I'm not going to do business. If I have to do business with African Americans, I'm not doing it anymore. And so you think, what happened? He must have just faded into obscurity. No, he did not. He became the governor of the state of Georgia in 1967 and was the governor until 1971. And he was the lieutenant governor when Governor Carter was our governor. Can you believe that? I'm saying all that to say my dad never supported Lester Maddox. That was something that I knew as a child, that our family was not a Lester Maddox family. And I don't know if my friends, I think many of my friends would say, no, we were on that train, and we weren't on that train. So for that, I was grateful. This was a little different about me growing up as it relates to race. When I was 11, my dad had an opportunity to go to South Africa to work. And so we went with him. And for 6 months, we lived in Johannesburg, South Africa. And it was under apartheid, which meant this huge country, 70% of the population was black, only 20% of the population was white, but all authority rested in the hands of the whites. Blacks had to be off the streets at night. They could only live in townships that were fenced in, and they had to be there by dark, and they faced capital punishment for offenses that whites would get just a mere slap of the wrist, and it was horrific. We saw the poverty, we saw the devastation, but that was 6 months. And then we moved back to Atlanta and started going to church, and pretty much didn't think a lot about race anymore. I became a follower of Jesus, but in the environment that I come from, what that meant was I was saved. I had joined the Christian team. I had prayed the right prayer, and that became the big deal. As far as it relates to race, I went to all white schools. I played on all white sports teams. I went to an all white church, and I had all white friends. And there was no judgment. I don't make any judgment about that. That was just the world that I lived in. When I graduated in 1979, there was one African American in our school, different class than I was in. I didn't know that person, and that was just the world that I grew up in. As a young teenager, I became a preacher, and it became for me a big deal, but I thought my job was to get people saved, get them on our team, get them to pray the prayer that we had prayed, then build a super big, successful church, become an influential pastor, and then as it relates to politics, I needed to vote for people and get our church to help vote for people to help us maintain the life that we were accustomed to or that we were living. Kind of the life that favored this middle class, white, getting saved, evangelical kind of a world. That's kind of embarrassing for me to say, but that's the reality of where I come from. I don't want to pretend that that wasn't my point of view, because it was. And a large number of people that I love, I think if they're listening to this right now, they would say, Ray, yeah, you nailed it. You nailed it. We didn't say racial slurs, but we just never thought about it because we lived in the suburbs and we just didn't have much exposure to people that were different from us. When I was young, I loved radio. In fact, I worked in radio. You can still hear the radio in my voice. One of the highlights to me is when someone comes up to me and says, hey, you have a good voice for radio. Have you ever thought about being in radio? And it's like, well, yeah, thank you very much. I actually was in radio. It makes me feel really good. We used to joke and say people had a face for radio, so I'm glad they're not saying that. You have a face for radio, Ray, although that probably is very true too. But I like the great voices of radio. And as a young man, I remembered a skilled broadcaster came along named Rush Limbaugh, and he started making waves on AM radio stations all across the country. And I listened, and I became a fan. He was funny at times. He was bombastic. He was interesting. I found him compelling. I listened and I let his words shape some of my thinking. And again, I'm more than a little embarrassed by the fact that I once listened to and kind of loved Rush Limbaugh, but I don't hide it because that's a part of my journey. And for those who are watching or listening, I bet many of you can relate, and you'd say, yeah, that's part of my journey too. But now I'm in the 6th decade of my life, and my perception is a little different. Actually, my perception's a lot different. I would now call myself a progressive follower of Jesus. I would say that my calling is to help people see the beauty of the Jesus path of love. And now I vote a lot differently than I once did. I love and embrace the idea of voting for the common good. What's helpful to all the people, especially those who have been left out. I want to always think about them. When I go to the booth to vote, I want to think about what's going to help the least of these. What's going to help the ones who have struggled the most? Not how can I maintain my position, but how can we help those who maybe have not experienced as much good fortune? Often people who know me, who have either been on the more progressive lane their whole life, or those who have remained conservative their whole life, they wonder how in the world my perspective went through such a radical change. Friends and family on the conservative side will ask me, Ray, tell us what went wrong. And friends and chosen family on the liberal side will say, Ray, tell us what went right. What happened to get you thinking like this? And you know what? I've discovered both of those questions apply, because my conservative friends are right. Some things in my life did go wrong before my beliefs and behavior could or would shift in the dramatic way that they have throughout my life's journey. And my progressive friends are also right that some things in my life had to go right before I also could experience such a shift. Well, it's Black History Month, and at the Village we celebrate that. We say Black Lives Matter, and we lift every voice and sing till all of heaven rings with harmonies of real justice and liberty for everybody. But we don't just quote the important words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders in the month of February. Whether we are black or white, straight or gay, cisgender or trans, we march towards justice and solidarity with brothers and sisters who are different than us. Remember, I said I didn't have much experience with people different. Now I understand, no, that's exactly what I'm supposed to do. We believe the march towards justice just happens to take place on a path created by following the footsteps of Jesus. And get this, the march toward justice happens on a path called love. We get those words, the march toward justice. You'll hear it all the time. But that's a concept that was championed by Dr. King. In a speech Dr. King gave just 4 days before his assassination, he said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." It was a phrase he used often and is a simplification of a longer quote by a Unitarian minister by the name of Theodore Parker, who fought for the abolition of slavery in the 19th century. In 1853, this is how Parker said it originally. Parker said, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience, but from what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice." Those words confirm a truth that comes from deep within the heart of our soul, really deep within the heart of every soul. It may take a while to get there, but we know we're going to get there. We believe the arc of the moral universe bends, and it bends towards justice. We believe love ultimately will win. At the Village, we say it like this sometimes: love is the point. That idea comes from the words of Jesus again when he simplified all of the commands. You know, when people want to argue about the Bible, and I still have people who want to argue with me about the Bible, and I've given up on arguing, which I'm so glad. That was about the most fruitless thing I've ever done in my life. But when people want to argue with me about the Bible, I try to get them to understand Jesus said the entire scriptures are summed up in one thing: love God with all of your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. You do that. Jesus says that is the point. That's the point. Love God, love your neighbor as you love yourself. We like to encourage others to work on loving yourself. I love this series that we have been in on self-care. We're going to pick that up in another few weeks. But I love that because you've got to learn how to love yourself. Here's a profound thought. A lot of messes in the world, both near to our personal lives and far away in conflicts on the other side of the planet, can be seen and understood as a failure to work on this point of love. And loving yourself is a big part of it. I can often be my harshest critic. That's why I don't like ever bashing somebody when they make a mistake, because I know they are their harshest critic. They're beating themselves up about that. We need to learn how to not shame ourselves. We need to learn how to accept that we are human and learn how to love ourselves and be compassionate towards ourselves. And then as we learn to love ourselves, we understand better how to love others. We say at the Village, love God, love your neighbor, work on loving yourself. And we say it that way because sometimes the hardest thing that we can ever do is love ourselves. And I would imagine maybe you're listening and you are nodding your head because you have struggled with that very thing. When we do the work of self-care and work on loving ourselves better, we develop the spiritual, physical, mental, and emotional strength and equipment that allows us to help others. We learn to love our neighbors better isn't just putting a little red heart emoticon on a post. When we really want to love our neighbor, it involves doing actionable items, and those things are hard to do if you don't first love yourself. Well, I started this talk telling you that my life was one way and now I am different, and it matters that things went wrong and that things went right to create within me the capacity to change. What got me off of one path, preacher, getting the world saved, not really caring about people outside of our group? That was the only group I really knew. It's the only thing I was really concerned with. What made the difference? Now I'm on a path where I really care about the moral arc of the universe. I really care about other groups. What makes the difference? You've heard me tell the story many times. I was married at the age of 17. I have two lovely sons from that marriage, but my basic counsel would be, yeah, probably you don't need to get married at 17, but I did. Married at 17, became a pastor of a Southern Baptist church at 19 years of age. I admired and wanted to be like one of my heroes, Pastor John Bassanio, First Baptist Church of Houston, Texas, one of the great preachers in the world, became a mentor to me. I aspired to the success, power, and prestige that I saw in him as a young mentee. I wanted to be like John Bassanio. And in a crazy way, I was well on my way. But then at the age of 24, I went through a divorce at a time when divorce was the end of the road for just about any pastor, but it was a virtual death sentence for a Southern Baptist pastor. It was, before I could even hardly get out of the gates, it was walls come crashing down, life is over. My dream was wrecked, and in so many ways it felt like my life was over before it had barely begun. But what I discovered is when I thought my life was over, it really was just beginning. What I thought was the worst thing that could ever happen to me, divorce, it actually saved me. With lots of time working to heal and grow over many years that shaped my perspective today, I now look back at what went wrong in my life and the redemptive Romans 8:28 way of God. You know the verse, all things work together for good to those who love the Lord. Somehow they all work together, even bad stuff works together. And I realized what went wrong actually helped right my way to help me grow into a person that has empathy for people outside of my group. I'm not so sure I would have experienced it the way I have had I not gone through the devastation of going through a divorce and suddenly feeling like I was outside of my group that I had always been so safe and secure inside of. Suddenly I began to feel just a little of what it was like to be on the outside. Without running off the road I was barreling down, I might be the pastor of a megachurch today. I used to think about that. Wealth. I would have liked to have tried the wealth part of it. Never part of the deal, I promise you. Power, security, those would have been wonderful things. But I wonder, had I stayed on that path, if I would have ever gotten around to seeing the world the way I see the world now. I don't think I could have. I don't think I would have thought about the common good like I'm able to think about the common good now. I really am grateful for the soul-shifting pain that I went through, because it began moving me from a life headed towards being solely self-focused towards a life that is focused more and more on love. Throughout the years, as I followed Jesus down the path toward love, I didn't become a big, powerful pastor, but I became a pastor to people who didn't have a pastor. And that's a different thing, and it's a beautiful thing. And I now actually feel like what I have been allowed to do is the greatest of all the callings. And I actually almost feel sorry for people that have stayed on that narrow path that I once thought was supposed to be my path. I now realize that my path has become the more beautiful journey. I look back at all the stories of the lives of people that I love, and I'm grateful that walking with them through their hard times, through maybe them feeling like they have been outsiders a bit, that has been a beautiful thing. People say, Ray, you don't have a big judgmental side of your heart. How can you? If you try to love people, you try to just experience them for who they are and appreciate them for who they are, how can you become their judge? Because you realize most everybody's just doing the very best they can, and you begin to have a heart for people who are outside of maybe the safe group that you grew up in. Psychology tells us our life circumstances shape where we land in between two ends of a value spectrum. One end of the value spectrum is intrinsically focused, and the other end of the spectrum is extrinsically focused. Now, don't get lost, because I think if you get this, it's kind of one of those profound thoughts that will ruminate in your mind over the next days and maybe will become quite helpful to you. Where we land along the intrinsic, extrinsic spectrum is intertwined with how we see life in a world surrounded by other people, people inside my tribe and people outside of my tribe. As a young man, my thoughts and beliefs were on the extrinsic side of the value spectrum. In my 6th decade of life, my thoughts and beliefs are on the intrinsic side of the spectrum. And I remember so clearly when the shift was happening for me. I mentioned Rush Limbaugh earlier. I loved him. I'm not joking. I loved him. But one day, listening in the car, something shifted. I listened to him do the same monologue I had heard him do 100 times. But this particular day, I heard cruelty. This particular day, I heard racism. He had been saying the same things, but something had happened. I had no longer held the position as senior pastor of a big Baptist church. I suddenly was seeing myself as more of an outsider, trying to figure out what this world was about. And now I was listening to this bombastic host of a radio show, and I was realizing he was talking to all of the insiders, and he was making fun of the outsiders. And I knew in that instant that wasn't the way of Jesus. And I listened for months, continually for a few more months. And during that time, more and more and more, I realized, what have I been listening to? That doesn't sound at all like the message of Jesus. There's no way that even comes close to being the message of Jesus. If you have a strong set of intrinsic values, your approach to life with other people is empathetic. It's more of a heart. You feel a strong affinity to people outside of your group. You find joy and wonder in the differences that people have. Listen, a few weeks ago, I met a lovely Hispanic couple in their 70s. And they invited me to their house, and I had tamales with them. And it was one of the greatest days of my life, because I had never been on that side. At least with this family, I'd never been on that side. And I saw the beauty. I saw their children. I saw the life they were building. And I loved it. When you're on the intrinsic side of the value spectrum, you have a healthy self-acceptance that's focused on your own personal healing, growth. It's not about thinking that you have arrived. It's not about thinking that you're in the superior group. It's about realizing that you're growing, and growing is a good thing. Intrinsic value leads to an optimistic faith in humanity and a desire to fight in solidarity with people who have been marginalized by inequality and unfairness. You want to fight for the underdog. That sounds a lot to me like village values, and it sounds a lot to me like the way of Jesus. If you have a strong set of extrinsic values, you're going to see the world differently. And again, please hear me. I, as a young pastor, had very much strong extrinsic values. That was what was predominantly operating in my life. I admired achievement, and again, nothing is wrong with achievement. I admired prestige and status and image and fame and wealth, and admiring it, if someone didn't have it, you still aspired to those things. And if you did have it, then you thought it really important to protect it. Being led by extrinsic values can lead people, not in every case, but in many cases, it can lead people to justify things like paying pathetic lower wages to people, making all the profits roll up to shareholders and to high management positions, while the workers who are actually keeping the machines running and who are making the products, while the workers have to go on welfare to supplement their low wages, while the company is having record profits. It's that justification of winning at all costs. It's that justification of violence to protect what you've achieved. It's that justification of an us versus them mentality, me before you mindset. It's that idea that rugged individualism is prized over the common good that makes life as good as it can be for both the strong and the weak. And for some of you that maybe recoil at the idea that we talk about the weak, listen, just please read the Gospels. Just read the Gospels and you tell me who Jesus was championing. And you can't read those words and honestly come up with rugged individualism or the idea that the strong are the strong because they're the ones who have the blessing of God. And that's not the way Jesus understood any of this. In addition to life circumstances, where we fall on the intrinsic, extrinsic value spectrum is also shaped by who we are surrounded by. How closed or how open your personal borders are to the ideas of people beyond your community makes a difference. This was another thing that happened for me. 20 years ago, I moved from the suburbs inside the perimeter, and things again shifted for me because I was able to see things I had never seen before. Even when I was a pastor after I'd gone through the divorce, and I was pastoring in the suburbs, I still was living in basically a 99% white middle-class world. Those are the people I saw. That was the only environment that I was really in. When I moved into the Atlanta area, inside the perimeter, I suddenly saw poverty, real poverty. I suddenly saw people who had no real hope for a better way to live. And I saw people with real problems, and I saw that there was nobody trying to help, and nothing seemed to be working. And I saw people generation and then another generation just getting deeper and deeper into despair. This is what happened. I became friends with people whose skin colors were different than my skin color. And I listened to them talk about their experiences, and I did something different than what I would have done 30 years ago. I didn't argue back with them about what it meant to be black, since I have such great experience on being black, right? I've never been black. I actually listened to them. And I realized that their experiences were true. I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful for the Herb and Tamikas in my life. I'm so grateful for the Jareds in my life. I'm so grateful for the Marshalls in my life. I'm so grateful for the Shakiras in my life. I'm so grateful for the Norveens in my life, because I hear their stories and I know they have seen the world through different eyes than me, and I trust what they are saying, and I say they are my brothers and my sisters, and I want to make sure that I'm on their team. I want to make sure I'm on their team. And as these things were happening for me, and I was going from this extrinsic focus to an intrinsic focus, I was becoming a more empathetic individual. I recognized this was the Jesus life, at least the Jesus life as I understand it. This is the Jesus life. And this is the life that you're invited to. This is the life I'm invited to. Listen, the easiest thing in the world is to say this prayer, sign the dotted line, check the box, you're in, and then that's it. That's it. You're a part of the in crowd. That's all you really have to worry about. Live a good life, but that's basically it. That's not the Jesus message. The Jesus message is, follow me. Jesus said, follow me. Live like I have lived. See people like I see them. Understand people are hurting. What did he say? When I was in prison, you came to visit me. When I was hungry, you cared and you fed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I was naked and had no clothes, you clothed me. And the people said, when did we do those things? And he said, you did it when you did it unto the least of these. That's when you were doing it unto me. I love that we celebrate Black History Month at the Village. And I love that we can all be on this journey, wherever we came from. Some of you came from a liberal, progressive place, and this has never even been a blip for you. You've got it. But many come from where I came from. And we have made a large jump, and it has been the most beautiful of journeys. And we're still learning, and we're still listening, and we're still being taught, because we have so much more that we want to know. Well, I have so much to say, but I think that's it for today. Would you bow your heads and have a prayer with me? Oh God, we acknowledge the pain and the suffering that has been caused by racism and discrimination all around us. Maybe even we have participated in it without even meaning to, some of us. We repent for the times that we have fallen short in showing your love to all of your children, regardless of color or creed. We ask for your forgiveness, and we ask for your guidance. Help us, O God, to see one another as you see us, created in your image, unique and beloved. Inspire us to listen with open hearts, to learn to speak with compassion, and to act justly in our daily lives. Bless our community that it may be a place of safety, understanding, and growth for all people. Guide us in building bridges of reconciliation and peace. May we celebrate our diversity as a strength, and may we work together for a future where every person is respected and valued. And we pray this in your holy name. Amen.
Yeah, you don't know how beautiful you are. Oh, how beautiful you are.
And one of the great problems of history is that the concepts of love and power have usually been contrasted as opposites. What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love, implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love.